get it. So, thank you all very much, and thank you to all the Or Emet members who are here. And I also took it upon myself to invite some other friends, people I've known, and lo and behold, a woman that I work with at the Jewish Federation here in St. Paul shows up. And some of my environmental activist friends from Lakeville show up, and people that I've known for 30, 40 plus years are also here. So thank you all. Dave mentioned that this started back in June at the annual meeting. Actually, it started in about 1969 or 1970 when Barry Cohn recommended that I read this book called They Fought Back. That was my first introduction to Jews of the resistance during the Holocaust. Without having the videos here, which you all have to see. I mean, you have to see people who are now in their 80s and 90s talk about their experiences in the ghettos and in the camps and in the forests and the actions they took upon themselves to resist the Nazi oppression. It's one of the most heartwarming, uplifting things I think that you can ever watch. So we certainly will send this stuff out, or even depending on how far we get through all the material here, maybe even a follow-up session or something that we would elect to do as not as a regular scheduled one, but something we would simply arrange. So over the past month and a half or so, I did a lot of reading, and then, oh, okay, well, yeah, yeah, and some of these friends still give me I did a lot of reading and watching these videos, and then in the last week or so, worked feverishly to try to get it all down into a reasonably sized presentation. I found all of this to be illuminating, uplifting, heartbreaking, and also frustrating. And I think you'll see what I mean by that, and perhaps you'll experience some of those emotions as well. A discussion about the Holocaust and resistance during the Holocaust is a tough topic for many reasons. I would like to read something from Jack Sutton. He and his wife Rochelle escaped from a ghetto, and for about 2 years were in the partisan group in the forests. They arrived here in St. Paul, and here's a few things that Jack said after they moved into an apartment on the corner of Grand and Dale. During the time we met with a number of American Jews, and I have to say that it was extremely difficult to talk with them about the Holocaust. Not because we were unwilling or afraid to speak, but because they simply could not understand, especially when I started to tell them about our time with the Jewish partisans. I had the feeling that they didn't believe what I was saying. Rochelle had the same sense as well, so we decided we would stop talking about our experiences. And Rochelle added, it just didn't register with him at all. The horror of it, the magnitude of it. We can talk and talk, but it didn't finally sink in. In addition, in talking about the resistance in the Holocaust, Anna Robel, the daughter of partisans in the forest, both her mom and her dad, said, there is no binary code of resistor versus victims when it comes to the Nazi genocide, but a continuum occupied by both. The one intimately fused to the other. Honoring resistors is a noble project that must be achieved. Therefore, without demeaning the dead and the survivors, what unified Europe's Jews, regardless of age, location, were that they were all victims of the Holocaust, of the final solution. And it is identification with the victims that produced and today produces compassionate acts of struggle. My parents taught us that the foremost role of Jewish resistance is to fight for the memory of the dead, the beaten, the broken, terrorized, starved, diseased, deceived. The majority of resistors and fighters, after all, were also killed. Now, without having the technology that we expected, will be reduced to some show and tell, so I can quickly pivot. This is a book that Jack and Rochelle wrote and was published here several years ago. I mentioned Anna Robel, whose parents were partisans in the forest. And now, I know this is being videotaped, but I do want to wear this t-shirt during the rest of the presentation. And you'll see that, if I can get this shirt on. No.
Would it help
sure,
if there was some appropriate music? No.
Everyone's a wise guy. So it says resist. Anna Robel was a partisan in the forest. I received an I just read to you something that Anna had written. I received an email from her. I contacted her a couple of weeks ago, and she did reply. If we have a chance, I'll read some poems that she had written about her mom and her dad. So let's continue. And I know some of you don't have the PowerPoint, but we will, excuse me, move on. So there's a context, a little bit of a context I want to provide. Now, when we talk about 6 million, because I'm not giving a history of the Holocaust, but I want to ground it in that number of 6 million. Now, 6 million is a number that almost becomes meaningless. I mean, really, what the hell does that mean? I mean, we talk about that. The Holocaust, 6 million. Holocaust, 6 million. So, since I can't do the math in my head anymore, using my calculator, what do we find? Well, in a period of about 5 years, the Nazis murdered about 1.2 million Jews per year. Per year. This is on an average. If we take a look at that on a monthly basis, it would be about an average of 100,000 a month. If we take a look at that weekly, it's nearly 25,000 every single week. So if we consider October, first week in October, 25,000. Second week, another 25,000. Third week, another 25,000. Fourth week in October, another 25,000. Men, women, elderly, frail, kids, resistors, passive resistors, people who were doctors, lawyers, craftsmen, tailors, leather workers, and so forth. Every week would be the equivalent of the population of perhaps Austin, Minnesota, Owatonna, White Bear Lake, or Chanhassen. All the residents of those cities each week just filling food. So that's part of the context. Another context is, when I was born late July 1945, just a few months after the final 2 camps, including Auschwitz, were liberated by Allied soldiers. What was the narrative that was not so much directly communicated to me, but was in the air as the full horror of the Holocaust emerged? Now, I have question 1, so fill in the blanks. Who knows the answer to that? Sergey.
They went like sheep to the gas chambers?
To slaughter. They went like sheep to the slaughter. Now, I was going to ask you to repeat that all together, and I see Janet here is just making a face. It's too creepy, perhaps. But I think that's the narrative. And I think your expression, Janet, I think reflects, I think what I heard. It wasn't the real.
I'm going to just add that
Please.
I remember when my kids were at Torah afternoon program, and I was sitting in the library listening to some of the teachers during a break, and one was Israeli, and that was her message too. We will not be like sheep going to the slaughter. That was when my, that was like 25 years ago.
And that narrative really didn't change for me fully until I read this book of compilations of memoirs and essays by Yuri Sewell. So that's a pretty kind of heady or heavy experience. And as a kid growing up, I know some of you have heard this, I mean, so there would be some of the Catholic Italian kids saying, "You Jew bastard, you killed my God." Now, I didn't even understand it, really. But all right. So there'd be these little tussles, and we'd exchange puckers, roll on the ground. But this was the narrative. This was the narrative. Now, Janet mentions that Israelis didn't like that so well. Now, there's a special day in Israel. Day of Remembrance. What is it called? Day of Remembrance. Day of Remembrance? Okay. You get partial credit. Very good. Yom HaShoah. Right, that's in Hebrew. The Day of Remembrance. Or the Day of the Holocaust. The Shoah. Right? But partial credit, Alan. I'm sorry. Dave, anyone else? Anyone want to help out here? Okay. The actual full name is not Day of Remembrance. Okay, I was going to look for the Hebrew right here, which I might butcher, but the full name is Yom HaZikaron.
She got it over here.
I said it.
What?
Zikaron? No, I said Yom HaZikaron.
Sarah's been saying it.
What is it?
Yeah, you were right. But I said Yom HaZikaron.
Yom HaZikaron LaShoah
Oh, I didn't know.
V'la Gevurah.
Oh, I've been truncating it.
You've been partial credit.
There are 3/4.
3/4. It's Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day. So just in the vernacular, to say it more briefly, without, Day of Remembrance, Day of the Shoah. But the full name is Day of the Holocaust and Heroism, or some people translate it into the Holocaust and Martyrs Remembrance Day. I think that's very important, and I'll get to that further towards the end of our discussion. Okay, we're going to move on to the next slide. And Janet, you mentioned when your kids were in Talmud Torah, there was an Israeli Hebrew school teacher who said, "No, we don't like that sheep to slaughter." Have people been to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C.? Anyone? Lots of hands go up. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, quite a number of hands go up. Many have been through, for better or worse, Hebrew school, well known for its poor pedagogy, or in synagogues. Did you learn about the resistance in any of those places? Any hands up?
I don't know that I did, but my kids went to Jewish day schools, and in their history classes, they always studied the Holocaust. And one year it was the Holocaust, and the next year the resistors.
Okay, so we got one.
I was going to say, I don't remember if there were like areas of resistance in those museums, but in media, films and stuff, there was a movie called The Gray Zone, and they would talk about, the resistance inside the camps when they blew up one of the ovens and things like that. So we get,
where did you see
Can
those?
you repeat into the mic for those?
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
there was a film called The Gray Zone about 15 years ago where they dealt with the topic of the resistance inside the camp.
Gray Zone, a video talking about resistance inside camps.
Just learning basically about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising.
Warsaw Ghetto being
My mom was a big fan of Escape from Sobibor, and so.
Escape from Sobibor, another large, I don't know, should I call it Hollywood, a major type of movie. And Sarah?
Oh, in
Yeah.
Hebrew school, the resistance was basically boiled down to Hannah Senesh. We like learned about Hannah Senesh, and then she was caught and killed. I feel like
Right.
that was kind of
Okay.
what we learned.
So for one of our members and musical leaders, it was boiled down to Hannah Sedesh, who was a member of Hashomer Hatzair, a socialist Zionist organization. She left from Palestine to go, and she was a parachuter and went behind enemy lines to warn people and help people about what was going on, and she was killed. Okay. So it seems there wasn't a whole lot there, was there? Now, as all peoples of various ethnic or racial identities, we get proud of names like Jonas Salk or Mel Brooks or George and Ira Gershwin, and even, of course, Sandy Koufax. Raise your hand. Can you name 3 resistors? Now, I'm not doing this to shame people, okay? Can anyone name, in addition to Hannah Senesh, who is kind of unique in what she did, coming from Palestine to parachute into behind the lines? Can someone name 3 resistors? All right, we got...
The Bielski brothers.
Bielski, well, there were 4 of those.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's very clever. It was Zeus and Tuvia, and I forget. Any other names?
No, I thought
No.
I figured I'd think that.
You got that, Barry.
Hirschglick, Mordecai Antilovich.
Okay. Hirschglick wrote this song,
Something
We Are Here, that is sung on Yom Kippur. Mordecai Anilovich was the leader of the fighting organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. I know I probably won't accomplish this today, but I think what I want us to be able to do is always know at least 3 names of resistance. And unfortunately, we won't see these people who are now in their 80s and 90s, who have these extraordinary interviews and discussions about their experiences. So we do need to follow up on that, but I will name some. So, and we'll follow up with sending stuff out. Okay, so what is resistance? Those are acts intended to thwart, limit, or end exercise of power by oppressor over oppressed. Another way of saying it is to delay, frustrate, or foil objectives and timetable. We'll go to the next slide since we won't see this. But in the context of the Holocaust, they made a nice 2x3 table. Okay, people like these kind of tables. So what we have here are basically 2 types of resistance in 3 types of, what I call it, venues or locations. So we have armed resistance, and we have what I call communal resistance. Each of these types of resistance occurred in all locations, in the forests, and in the ghettos, and in the camps. It is important to note that the opportunities to engage in any of these acts of resistance depended on a few different things. One was certainly the degree of Nazi control. And in the camps was where there was the largest amount of control, where people's movements, access to food, medicine, talking with each other was the most restricted. So there were really fewer acts of either communal or armed resistance in the camps, but they did occur. In the ghettos, and this is where in hundreds of cities in German-occupied territories, Jews were herded into usually the worst parts of towns, walls built. They were prevented from leaving legally because there were resistors who left and went back and forth to courier information, bring in armaments. There were curfews typically, like from early evening to early morning, where they weren't allowed to leave their homes. And in these homes, it was very crowded. Access to food was very limited. No medical sanitation was very poor. People were basically torn away from their regular jobs and avocations and daily business. So it was a very, very controlled. But because they could meet together in those apartments and sneak around, there was more types of resistance. And in the forest, this is where people who either before the ghettos were established or escaped from ghettos met up and banded together with each other, sometimes in all Jewish units, sometimes with other Poles or Ukrainians, and sometimes with remnants of the Soviet Army, the Red Army, who escaped fighting the Germans and set themselves up as partisan units in the forest. So there they had the highest degree of freedom to organize, to rescue, and to carry out actions against the Nazis, blowing up railroads and so forth. Okay, maybe we'll go to the next slide. So in this armed resistance, they were explosive, sometimes smuggled into ghettos. In the forests, they were stolen. Also in the ghettos, in the Warsaw and other uprisings, there were the homemade Molotov cocktails. Guns and bullets were very precious. Why? Because they were so few. And axes. When I talk about the Sobibor camp, I'll explain what happened there. And I also include rescue and escape. So Jewish partisans often rescued Jews who were living in ghettos and helped them escape. And it often involved weaponry, so I include it under armed resistance. We'll now go to what I call communal resistance. In the various materials I read, there were a whole bunch of phrases used, like unarmed resistance, passive resistance, and spiritual resistance. So you'd say, oh, spiritual resistance. And then they would go talk about all kinds of activities which Jews undertook in all three of those locations. So I took it upon myself to propose just using one term to cover all of them. And so here we are in difficult circumstances, whether in the camps, the forests, or the ghettos, merely to survive was an act of resistance. To share a bit of food that was stolen from the Nazis was an act of resistance. To sharing that food with an elderly person or a sick child. Celebrating birthdays, Jewish holidays, which was illegal in the ghettos and certainly not allowed in the camps. Education. Schools were set up both for kids and for adults, and these had to be done undercover. Observance of Jewish holidays had to be done again undercover. Create. People wrote poems and memoirs, and in several instances, as in the Warsaw ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum put these in canisters, and they were found after the ghetto was razed and then finally liberated. And we have this incredible history of Warsaw as the city itself, plus life in the ghetto. So it's a very rich description about all these kinds of activities that occurred. Barry?
I just add to your list sabotage, because some of the forced labor.
Yeah, well, that would go under armed resistance, I think. So sabotage, and that's where explosives were used to destroy railroad crossings, arms, and then in the ghettos when there were the fighting against the Nazis as they came in, it was just a moment, and it was often at the end of the ghetto when most Jews were already taken to the extermination camps. And they used the Molotov cocktails to blow up tanks and to engage in battle.
Oh, there was also, maybe this Barry was thinking of this also, the manufacturing sabotage, where you would put, you'd
Yes.
screw up
Right, they screw- yes,
assembling a
right.
B-2 rocket or something.
Yes, well, even in the camps that occurred, where they were assigned, there were work details, people would intentionally, it happened in the ghettos as well, people would intentionally do shoddy work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sabotage is a French term. And sabot, people know French? Sabot shoes.
Wooden shoes.
Wooden shoes. So it had to do when French workers would put their shoes into the machinery to disrupt the production of some goods. Sabotage. Okay, maybe a little side, yes, a little side point there about sabotage. So I said save. So it was people saving, Jewish history books, Jewish prayer books, scrolls, Torahs, and personal items as well. And I also include couriers, and we may have time to talk about that more. So there's incredible stories of couriers who went from the ghettos, outside the gates, the walls of the ghetto, to tell people what was going on, to exchange information with Jews who were hiding out in other parts of the city who managed to escape from herding in. They even traveled from ghetto to ghetto to help communication. So this was all very limited. And it was largely women who did this. There are wonderful stories. We may not see them, but you will some other time in the future. Okay, so we'll move along now and try to focus in a little bit on each of these areas. So, the Jewish partisans, which are what the groups in the forests were called, and there are over 100 of these. And I do have a correction to make. In the invitation, it's not Sean's fault, it was mine. I said there were 20 to 30,000 Jews who resisted during the Holocaust. Actually, it was only 20 to 30,000 partisans who banded together in the forests. So that number, I shortchanged the amount of activity of resistance generally during the Holocaust period. So I wanted to make sure that we all understood that. We're going to miss today a wonderful introduction to the partisans narrated by Mr. Grant, Ed Asner. His cousin Avram was a resistor in Poland, and I'll include some links to interviews about Abraham Asner as well. So at the back of the PowerPoint handout, there are a couple of maps, and you'll see resistance in the ghettos. See, Randy, you rolled it up. How are you going to look at it?
No, I just mess with it. How like you do.
Yeah. And so you'll have a sense of geographically where they were and how many there were. So about 100 of these partisan units in the German-occupied territories. So we'll move on, and I think in the next slide, what I can talk about is what will be missing. And we have Frank Blakeman, who, when he was 16, escaped from a ghetto, but he knew the shit was coming, and he got out. They were going to be rounding up Jews in his smaller town where he was. He was only 16 years old. But he escaped from the ghetto and joined up with the partisan band. And here he talked about the life in the forest and the difficulties of daily life and survival. There were no REI stores there to help people through the hot summers and the cold winters. They didn't escape with a backpack full of items. They really had to make do, oftentimes even through the winters, with blankets. There's a woman describing how they dug bunkers and piled dirt so the winter would be manageable. The difficulty of getting food, they also talked about. There were some friendly, or as Frank talks about, I think in Poland or in Ukraine, there were friendly farmers who freely gave food and milk to these bands. But sometimes that didn't happen. So these folks took it upon themselves to take it. Sometimes the German army prepared various food for the soldiers. They would go steal it and leave a slip saying, "We took it." Okay? So life was very, very difficult, even though they were much less under the watch and control of Nazi guards. Frank talked here about any Jew welcome. He said, Alan.
Sorry, just JPEF is an acronym that's showing up a couple times.
Yes, okay, yeah. Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation.
Thank you.
And there's a resource list. It's a short one, but I didn't want to overburden either myself yesterday when I was doing this, or your reading. But there's a website with incredible stuff there. Okay, thank you. So, Alan, thanks for pointing that out, and I'll note the source as we go through this, since you won't actually be seeing this. So he talked about it was open to any Jew who showed up. There were some partisan groups that were very leery and hesitant about bringing in kids or elderly and infirm because of the added burden of taking care of those people. But he said, for our band of partisans, we made sure that any Jew was welcome. Now, the Bielski brothers were mentioned, and there is a major movie called Defiance. Anyone seen Defiance? Yeah.
2008.
2000, yeah, major Hollywood motion picture. It was these four brothers that were just really rough and tumble guys. And their goal was to rescue and save Jews. One of the brothers said, it's more important to save a Jew than to kill a German. So there was a variety of approaches to all of these partisan groups in the forest. They were not uniform in many ways. The Bielski brothers started off with maybe 40 or so. I mean, it was their immediate, these four brothers, these rough and tumble, tough guys. And it grew and grew, and they had to move a lot as it grew from 40 to 100 to 200 to 400. And they would move so that they would have, I say, larger accommodations. I think you have some idea of what I mean by accommodations, but larger areas to accommodate and serve the members. They wound up being about 1,200 in that group. And by that time, when they had that full complement, it was like a little village out in the forest. I mean, they had a woodworker shop, they had a leatherworking shop, they had kitchen, they had areas for communal activities. So it really was quite an undertaking that they had. So we'll move along. And more of these Jewish partisan educational foundation. There are people here talking about the difficulty of shelter, and in much more rich terms than I can describe. So I guess what I'm just planting is we all have something to look forward to when you're able to get home and see these things. We'll move along to the next. Oh, there. Okay. Yeah. Well, here you'll see Etta Robel and Faye Schulman. This is Etta. And I thought it would be important, in addition to just me wearing this t-shirt proudly, to actually hear from Etta talking about her experiences in the resistance and what it meant for her and her husband and how they survived. Faye Shulman is an interesting person. I wish we could have had her come down here from Toronto, where she's now living. She was a photographer before the war. She was able to smuggle out a camera, and she took pictures. And she said, thank you. An act of sharing, part of the communal resistance. Do I get a piece of bread? But Faye, just a wonderful telling of the tale of being the photographer and how important that was to document the life in the forests. And there are pictures in different websites that have those photos that Faye took. And, you know, I bet you can guess she didn't have a darkroom. And this is in the old days when they actually used like film. You know, it wasn't on her smartphone. And how she had to, the difficulty of getting the chemicals to develop negatives and do the prints, and using just daylight for the light that needed to actually produce the print. So wonderful women with great spirit in their 80s and 90s. So we'll move along from the forest to the ghettos. And I think you'll see in your maps that there are hundreds of ghettos in some of the very large cities like Warsaw, Minsk, Bialystok. I always think of Mel Brooks. Okay, the producers, Bialystok. Yeah, but it was a real city, and there was a very large ghetto there. So beginning in the early 40s, I think it was 41 or 42, the Nazis began rounding up Jews, herding them into these ghettos. And as I mentioned, they were usually in the poor, rundown part of town. Gates, fencing, walls were erected. And for several years, they allowed Jews to live in the ghettos. The killing of Jews actually started before the ghettos, as the Germans overran Eastern Europe and invaded the Soviet Union. It was just mass shootings. So there were over 1 million, as we're talking about 6 million, over 1 million Jews were killed by these mass shootings. The Nazis realized it's not so efficient. And so they herded Jews into ghettos. And even at that time, what became known as what we call the final solution of getting rid of these vermin, these people who are subhuman, emerged. People were in the ghettos. And so for some few years, under miserable conditions, were allowed to live. And then that final solution was really implemented in the extermination camps. And that's when they began rounding up Jews, taking them away from the ghettos into those camps, where some were immediately gassed and murdered, some were put to work in labor camps, and some lived for some time in concentration camps, and then the killing machinery was enhanced and expanded in even the concentration camps. So it's a point to note that rather than, I think as I understood growing up, in an undifferentiated way, oh, well, they were the concentration camps and that's where all the Jews were killed. Well, that's not the case. They were the mass shootings as the Nazis came across Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union, and then moved into different types of camps, forced labor camps, and then the extermination and concentration camps. But in the ghettos, there were many ways in which Jews said, we are holding on to our humanity in those communal resistance activities. We're holding on to our humanity by sharing, Janet, thank you. Actors organizing little theaters, dancers doing performances, people sharing their writings, schools for kids. There were resistance groups organized in about 100 of these ghettos. In the early phases of life in the ghetto, they focused on those communal resistance activities, regaining, reclaiming, holding on to their humanity. But as Jews were taken out and sent to the extermination and concentration camps, word began to get back to the ghettos. There were people who escaped from either the camps and in the forests say, this is what's going on. And then it was those couriers went from ghetto to ghetto and talked about what was going on. And in response to those changing conditions, unfortunately, after many, many Jews, thousands, hundreds, millions were murdered, there were also uprisings. And there were 5 major uprisings. Warsaw, and I think someone mentioned Warsaw being the most well-known. And there's remarkable footage and pictures of that ghetto going up in flames, of the fires, both instigated by the Jewish resistors, by the Jewish Fighting Organization, through the Molotov cocktails. And the comments by the surviving resistors talking about, we sent them running. So that day when they came up, the Nazi army, different units came in, say in Warsaw, to get rid of the remaining, I think there were 60,000 Jews finally in Warsaw at the time of the uprising. Started off with 300 or so. But the pride people felt in pushing back that final dissolution of the ghetto was enormous. And there are some remarkable pictures of people standing about to be shot by the Nazis. So these major uprisings took place in, as I said, in 5 of the major ghettos and in others as well.
So, Howard, if
Yes.
I can interrupt, there's an outside chance I might be able to get some Wi-Fi. If you want to take a short break, or if you want me to disconnect and work on it while you keep going.
I'll keep going, is that okay?
Sure.
It's 11:15.
I'll just disconnect, and then if I get it working, then we'll show together.
Okay, sure. You have to meet these people. So I'll take the break in order to do that, but I'll keep going. I'll keep going, and I'll say, yeah, you really got to meet them and not just hear me talk about all this stuff. So in the Vilna ghetto, Abba Kovner heard about, again, it's these couriers going back and forth. Very limited. I don't want to elevate that like there was this everyday service of couriers bringing information. But he heard about what happened in Warsaw with that uprising. And he heard about reports from the concentration camps about what the Nazis were doing. And he has this long proclamation about how we must resist. And I'll just read a few pieces of that. Let's not go like sheep to slaughter. Isn't that fast? This is what he wrote. Let us not go like sheep to slaughter. Let us defend ourselves to our very last breath. True, this is how he ends it. True, we are weak and we are getting no help. But the only dignified answer to the enemy is to resist. It is better to fall like free fighters than to live at the mercy of murderers. resist to your very last breath. And that was a proclamation that went out to the Vilna ghetto. Kovner actually survived that uprising, and he retreated into the forest and hooked up with some Jewish partisans, who then hooked up with some Red Army partisans, and they fought against Germans in skirmishes for some time. Okay.
I do have Wi-Fi. I don't have links to the videos directly. So what I think we might want to do is have you go, and then if you want to handpick some videos, we can show them at the end.
Okay, let's do that. So I'll try to stay mindful of the time and give us maybe 20 minutes or so. I'll rush through this, okay? Yeah, okay. So you'll be able to get to YouTube. This is great. This is great news, I gotta tell you. Okay, so and in Warsaw, so this movie is from it's a documentary from Yad Vashem. It's just 8.5 minutes, but it's interviews and recollections by several of the fighters from the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So you get a variety of viewpoints and experiences of what they did to prepare for that. And what you hear from them is how every gun and bullet was precious. I mean, they were not Jewish militias, under the Second Amendment, as we have in, Idaho and Montana, armed to the teeth. These are people living in Warsaw or Vilna, living lives and not being organized. So in the ghettos, to get guns was a very, very difficult undertaking. So there were some friendly, sympathetic Polish resistance members of the Polish Communist Party, who were able to either give or sell guns that were then in hiding, snuck into the ghetto, and the same thing with bullets. So, and they did some training, and there would be like one gun for 10, 15, or 20 people. And they planned this uprising, and they knew where people would be, and in the bunkers and on rooftops with the Molotov cocktails. And what they said is, every bullet has to count. We'll move on. And so I did read the Avner Kovner, or a piece of it, and this is Vitka Kovner. So people who went on, they were from Hashomer HaTzair, which is a socialist Zionist youth movement group. They settled in Israel, and this is a terrific interview with her. So we'll move along though. And in the camps, as I mentioned, this is the most difficult of circumstances that you can imagine to do anything. So even the communal activities of claiming and holding on to their humanity was more and more difficult to meet together, to do any kind of planning was nearly impossible. Sobibor took place in February of 1943, Treblinka in August of 1943, and Auschwitz in October of 1944. If we move on to the next slide, what we'll hear is Thomas Flatt, again, just wonderful spirit, and for many of these people, the kind of Polish accents is something in English, something I'm very familiar with in how they speak and talking. So listening to Thomas Flatt is fascinating. To talk about how in the ghetto, Sasha Pechersky stood up and gave a rousing speech to people gathered around before they undertook the attempt to kill some Nazis. to blow up some of the killing machinery and to lead Jews out to safety. Unfortunately, in many of these cases, I don't have the numbers right here in my head, here and in other instances, many more attempted to escape and were either killed upon leaving the camp or shortly thereafterward. It was in Sobibor. Yes?
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine. I'm glad to take it.
So I imagine if there was an uprising in a camp, those people were dealt with very harshly.
Yes. So,
And so I wonder how, if there were other uprisings that no one ever knows about because those people were killed and then either there weren't survivors that remembered their names or the events or weren't in that space at the time.
yeah, this is a good theme in terms of a summary of what we know and don't know about resistance activities, and why some of the numbers are kind of very rough estimates. The question was about instances where those who may have participated in an uprising in a camp were all killed, and so no one ever knew about it. It certainly wasn't going to be part of the German history or the Nazi history about what went on in these places, about resistance to the almighty army, where perhaps there was damage done to the camp and so forth, and X number of guards were killed. It wasn't something they were going to bring forward and proclaim proudly. So that is an important point about this whole study of the Holocaust and resistance. It was in Sobibor where, so I'll tell one little story. So the idea was, as Thomas Flatt talked about, well, as Jews were taken into the camp, some had, coats and clothing and boots, and some were in pretty nice shape, and they had a sword, all this stuff. And you think how sad it is. And these Nazi guards, I'd like that, I'd like that. So what they organized was a little scheme to invite Nazi guards. Oh, we got a nice leather coat and boots. Why don't you come in here into this room? Not where the stuff is we're going to throw out, where we got the nice stuff. And you can choose what you want. And so when they come in, and they had gotten, I'm not sure where they got the axes. And, okay, I see a face, yes. And it sounds like some American horror movie, I don't know, the Friday the 13th or something. But they murdered about 3 or 4 of these guards as part of the initial phase of the uprising in Sobibor. Thomas Flatt tells a better story than I do. We'll see what we're able to watch later on. Moving on to talk about the camps another way. This is a longer overview about the uprising in Sobibor. But if we go to the next slide, we'll see about Auschwitz. So I think if most Americans, Jews or non-Jews, think of camps, it would be like Buchenwald, Auschwitz, where the worst of the worst, where most of the killings got done. So here we have Anne Heilemann talking about she and her sisters who were able to go outside the camp and get materials in order to make explosives. And how many actually, and some were killed doing that, but some successfully brought in those explosives. And they were actually able to shut down one of the crematorium in Auschwitz as part of their uprising. So to think the difficulty of having couriers go in and out of the camp, of gathering together outside the watchful eyes and ears and nose of the Nazi guards, and to plan this activity, to put together the materials in order to make these explosives, was fraught with difficulty. To pick up on something that Dave said, there's the notion of collective responsibility that the Nazis implemented. So whether it was in the camps or the ghettos, if there were a handful of Jews who escaped, they would say, we're going to make a show of that. They would just pull out 100, 200 people and shoot them and say, don't escape. So that also became, in terms of having what to do, became some very deep, troubling questions on making decisions about whether to try to escape from the ghetto, whether to undertake any of these forms of armed activities. Okay, we can talk a little bit about the couriers next, which I think I've covered. The purpose was for communication, and so that was one way in which people living in ghettos found out about the final solution and the killing that was taking place in the camps, and that their lives were in danger. It was also to share activities about the extent and development of the organizations and what was going on. Was that a question? Yes?
I don't know if you know anything about this. My grandparents and extended family weren't in an extermination camp. They were in a forced labor camp in Riga, Latvia. Do you know whether the labor camps, resistance, anything going on there?
Sabotage.
No, but we can find out. Good enough. I think there were, but we should follow up on that. So this communication was very important, and so was the smuggling of persons and of weapons, and I think I've mentioned some of that. But I just want to tell two stories. Joe Kurik from the Ukraine, somewhat unusual, one of the men doing some of this communication and going in and out of ghettos and sharing information. So he got stopped by Nazi guards once entering a ghetto in the Ukraine. So they said, well, what do you, and he was chosen to do it because he didn't look particularly Jewish. So the guards stopped him. They said, well, what are you doing? Why do you want to go into the ghetto? And he said, I'm going to go rob some Jews. And he said, all right, good, go. And he went about his business. And there was another woman smuggling bullets back into the ghetto. And the bullets were on the bottom of her bag. On top were potatoes. She gets stopped by a guard, and she's like, this is it. I'm done for. What do you got in there? I got potatoes. And you're like, okay, good. You can go. And she, so these were some of the ways in which these couriers and smugglers undertook their activities.
Why was it easier for women?
It was easier for women because being outside the ghetto walls, to have a man of fighting age walking around was very, suspicious. And not only were women chosen, because a woman walking around wouldn't seem as perhaps threatening or as subversive, maybe that's really, as possibly subversive. But the women were also selected for other reasons. As with Joe Kubrick's case, they perhaps didn't look particularly Jewish. I mean, so there's a picture of Chaya Grossman, also a Hashomer Hatzair member of the Socialist Zionist Youth Movement, very blonde hair, and she was a Kurd. She wound up settling in Israel, became a member of the Knesset, and carried forth her political views and activities as in Israel. So it was the appearances, and also those who were able to speak Polish, for example, who were Ukrainian without much of a Jewish or Yiddish accent, were also then most likely to be selected to do those kinds of activities. So, yes?
I know you said the couriers were trying to communicate with other Jews in ghettos and stuff. Were they also trying to get the word out to the rest of the world? What
Yes,
was
they did.
happening and how
Yes.
were they
Yes, they
doing it?
did. And you raise another kind of major theme about this whole enterprise, and that's people, so that some of these couriers would go visit with maybe either other Jews or non-Jews in city councils and other sympathetic groups. They couldn't believe it. That this is actually what's going on, this systematic extermination of hundreds of thousands of people. And it was a very difficult to fully comprehend. And it was only after the camps were fully liberated in the beginning of 1945, I think the Red Army liberated the first camp, and that went on through April, when the Soviet Union and other Western allies walked into those places, that the reality was able to be visited upon the entire world. So it took a while. It wasn't something that even Jews believed. And certainly early on in the period, in 40, 41, they were the herding into ghettos, whatever it is. It will pass. Things won't be so bad. We've lived here for so long. Certainly in Germany, they were very, very integrated. Yes.
Wasn't Roosevelt told even before the war that this was happening?
Well, other troubling aspects. Well, we entered in 41. I mean, there were pleas to even specifically bomb trains going to Auschwitz. The decision made by the Allies was that winning the war is most important, and in the long run will save more lives. You can debate that, I'm sure, but as word was getting out to leaders of the Western countries, it was even hard to believe, and even whether believe getting to the end of the war by defeating the Germans was a priority. And remember, I think it was about 20,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, 300 some odd thousand British soldiers, 410 American soldiers. So this was quite a battle. And there was certainly controversy about Roosevelt and the other Western Allies' decision. Yes?
So with the couriers coming into the camps, they would want to deal with the leaders of that camp to share the information.
Mm-hmm.
And then what would the leader do with that? Would he try and contain the information to keep calm in the camp?
Well,
can you repeat?
Yeah, the question was about couriers going into the camp with some information about what was going on elsewhere. It's a good question. So actually, I'll pick up on a general matter about how in the forests or in the ghettos, perhaps less so in the camps, people organize themselves. And the organizers or the leaders were people who had kind of the right kind of experience in these youth movement groups. They were mostly from left of center organizations, HaShomer HaTzair, Dror, as Zionist left-wing groups. The Bund, which was a socialist but non-Zionist organization that developed labor, initiated labor unions, and said that Jews should remain throughout the world but live as Jews as part of a socialist dream. And there were a few other youth movements as well. Beitar, which is the revisionist movement, and Menachem Begin was associated with the Beitar revisionist movement. But it was mostly men and women in their late teens and early 20s who were community organizers. They were teachers. They had organized groups and youth groups and summer camps and schools and led study sessions to promote their ideals and vision of a better society. So because of those experiences, they were the ones who emerged to join together. I mean, they had ideological differences, but for the left groups, they were more easily joined together. And as in Warsaw, when Beitar, the revisionist group, initiated its own organization to help people, when it came for the final uprising, there was a smaller one in January, but in April, the major Warsaw Ghetto uprising, with which we're familiar, they all joined together into a single organization. And that's where Mordecai Anilovich, that Barry mentioned, was the leader of what was called the Jewish Fighting Organization. And he was a member of Hashomer Hatzair, which was a socialist Zionist organization. So it was really through those people who had the organizational experience and a commitment to and dreams of a new society, even in the ghettos, they were able to emerge and get word out to the masses of people and to hold those organization and planning meetings in smaller groups. I hope that answer the question?
Well, kind of. I mean,
Okay.
I guess I just wanted to know what happened with the information that the couriers brought into the camp.
Yeah, they would share that.
Okay.
They would share that. Yeah, so and it was through the leaders, and then people were assigned different sections of the ghetto where they lived in bunkers, and so there might be like a block leader around, and so they would get the word to that person, and they would share that when they could, because they were under the watchful eye. There were curfews like from 7 to 7, so to get from one place to another, to have one of these planning meetings, they had to be very careful. So they built underground tunnels and connections to be able to do that. Oh boy. Okay. I'm fine. No, what I'm thinking is, I think we've covered the main message of what happened. What I also wanted to include was the enduring questions and troubling issues. I will do that in about 5 minutes, perhaps, or less. Maybe just introduce you to that so that we could see the videos. Would that take how much time for you to get that set up and getting into YouTube?
I'm going to say 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. So if we move on to we have tough questions and no easy answers. So actually, after I wrote this, What Obstacles Did Jews Face, I also wanted to turn it on its head and say, what resources did Jews rely upon? And because of that good question we just heard, part of my answer to this question was, it was these people who had those kinds of experiences. And I think peppered throughout the discussion, you can see that they were friendly and supportive non-Jews who were able to provide either food or bullets or other kind of armaments, and some who didn't want to share that, even though they had the same goal of defeating the Nazis. And I also talked about the degree of control that the Nazis exerted in the different areas, and particularly in the ghettos and in the camps. So it was tremendously difficult to organize and carry out these activities. Now we are a humanistic congregation where God does not play a major role in what we think about how we need to act in the world or how we organize and conduct our lives. And I almost, and I did have a smart-ass answer, but I also realized, thinking of what Anna Robel wrote about people who survived, people who resisted, and that there's not a difference. This was a tremendously, deeply, profoundly addressed question by many, many Jews sitting in those camps or ghettos, watching their kids suffer because of malnutrition, knowing that people were carted off and were killed.